Since starting YouTube, I've been getting a lot of the same questions. Questions like, why do you sound like a 13-year-old boy trying to solve mysteries? What do you look like? And, oh my god, you're wrong, my favorite soundtrack is better than anything else on Earth. And I tend to always answer these questions in the exact same way. I don't know, something testosterone. I look like a young and unemployed Santa Claus, and that's great. I'm honestly really happy for you that you have a soundtrack that you really like. Don't let some random guy on the internet tell you that you aren't allowed to like it. But if you maybe want to get a better idea as to why you might like your favorite soundtrack, then I'd suggest these 3 other videos that I made talking about how and why people might like the music that they like. But by far, the one question I get asked more than anything else is, what is your favorite soundtrack? And instead of just telling you that it's Kill the Wabbit, I kind of want to walk you through my thought process so that I don't just sound like a pretentious classic music elitist. Don't get me wrong, I am absolutely a classic music elitist, I just don't want to sound like it. A lot of people like to ask what is good music or bad music. This is good music, that's bad music. And the discussion tends to not go much farther than that. But one thing I like to ask is this music effective? Because suddenly it forces people to ask not just if the music is good or bad, but why the music is good or bad, or at the very least effective. So when it comes to something like pop music, well, what makes a piece of pop music effective? Well, what is it trying to do? It's trying to make the most money possible, right? The Billboard Top 100 and all those charts that exist all over the world have nothing to do with the music theory behind a piece or how complicated it might be. It's all about how many units are sold. So if you want to have an effective piece of pop music, then you want something that's going to sell the most, meaning that the piece of music is going to need to resonate with as many people as possible. And you're going to want to write something that sits at the very top of the bell curve, where you can get as many people as you can to understand and enjoy it, which I want to clarify is an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. Otherwise, everyone with a music degree would have way more money than they actually do. But compare that to something like my favorite song, Der Erlkönig by Schubert. Sure, he was probably trying to sell copies of the score to make money, but I think more importantly, he was trying to explore the original work and express that work in a song. So was it effective at expressing all the concepts that were within that original work? I like to think so. So with that in mind, and I want to clarify, by all means, enjoy what you enjoy. I'm just trying to show you my thinking. But instead of asking if a soundtrack is good or bad, what if the question was, what makes a soundtrack effective? Well, you could just say that the music sounds good, or you feel like it fits in with whatever's on the screen and sets the mood, and if that's where you want to leave it, that's fine. But you're kind of losing out on the potential that music has for storytelling. And I'm sure that right now a lot of you are going to be like, oh, he's going to talk about leitmotifs again, and you're not wrong. But for the uninitiated, a leitmotif is a musical idea that represents a person, place, or thing in a narrative. At least, that's what a lot of people will tell you. And that's technically the definition, like in the dictionary and stuff, but that's not really super accurate, and it kind of misses the point, I think. Let me show you what I mean. So let's say we have a story and we want to slap a soundtrack onto it, and we represent a character or idea or whatever with a theme, and we repeat that theme whenever that character or idea or whatever reappears.
Don't be afraid. Oh, don't worry, he'll be all right.
Use the Force, Luke. Let go, Luke.
It's nothing particularly groundbreaking or complicated, but it can be exceptionally powerful when used properly in a score. Like, instead of just announcing that the main character has arrived and is doing something heroic, what if you played that piece of music to evoke the idea of that thing, even though you might not actually see it on screen? This is something that The Last Jedi did extremely well. Check out this scene when Snoke mentions Vader. It's one thing to talk about him, but you hear that Imperial March and you feel Vader's presence. Or here, Rey's talking about something that she hasn't been able to identify within herself, and check out what we hear.
But now it's awake. And I'm afraid. I don't know what it is.
Spoilers, it's the Force theme. She's talking about the Force. So this idea of just repeating the same piece of music over and over again is technically called motto theme, or more likely an idée fixe, depending on who you're talking to. I've heard motto theme be used for Beethoven 5, but most people talk about an idée fixe with Berlioz' Symphonie Fantastique. In short, it's a musical idea that repeats throughout a piece. And in the grand scheme of things, it's not really storytelling. It's the musical equivalent of screaming somebody's name when they walk into a room. That's like bragging that you have the same actor representing the same character in the sequel. Copying and pasting isn't really any kind of development or anything, it's just copying and pasting. And for the sake of argument, I'm going to call this thematic repetition. Don't worry about why for now, we're going to come back to it. Now, a way that we might better use that thematic material could be if we changed it based on the situation. So, like right here, we have Poe flying around and we hear the main theme to Star Wars, kind of being used as this sort of heroic theme, but it gets altered to fit the situation. The scene is more tense, more action-packed, so it changes. The technical term we'd use here, I think, is fragmentation. The main theme is being fragmented to fit what's happening on the screen, and fragmentation is one of the techniques that you could use if you're looking to create some sort of thematic transformation. Changing a theme, like when a theme is altered to fit whatever happens on the screen, is called thematic transformation. And it comes from this guy called Liszt, who would write these pieces called symphonic poems, where he'd take a story and then communicate that story through a symphony. And when he altered his themes to express the shifting context of the story, academics called that thematic transformation. Except this is where all the definitions start to fall apart for me. So let's get back to that whole effective soundtrack thing. We have thematic repetition, which is just repeating themes, and that can be effective. Then we have thematic transformation, which is changing a theme to better fit what's going on in the story. But what if we could take that a step further? What if the transformations were happening for a specific reason? Like, check out Doug Adams explain the relationship between Anakin's theme in the prequels and the Imperial March.
So you have these chords. But if I changed all that to just minor, you start to recognize this is the Imperial March chords.
Here we have an example of one thing transforming into another theme in order to musically mirror exactly what's happening in the story and demonstrate how all the ideas in the story are related. This is something I like to call thematic mutation. I don't think you're really going to hear anybody else call it that, and here's the best time to explain all these definition problems. Okay, so we have our three techniques: thematic repetition, thematic transformation, and thematic mutation. I made two of these up, I think. Like, I have found some people calling some stuff this, but I'm trying to explain my thinking here, and I don't think you're going to hear anybody else use these terms in this way. Just keep that in mind. Now, in the popular mindset, all three of these things are leitmotifs. This is all leitmotif if a leitmotif is a musical representation of a person, place, or thing in a story. But that means that leitmotif isn't really that descriptive in terms of how any of these musical ideas are used. Beyond that, I can't find anyone creating a distinction between what I'm calling thematic transformation and thematic mutation. From what I've found, the academics just call any theme that changes or has changed some kind of thematic transformation. And I think that's because when Wagner, the guy who basically created leitmotifs, used leitmotifs, he went hard. And with all that said and done, I'd like to show you my favorite soundtrack. This is Der Ring des Nibelungen, or The Ring of the Nibelung, Wagner's magnum opus. It's a series of 4 operas: Das Rheingold, Die Valkyrie, Siegfried, and Götterdämmerung. And believe it or not, you know these operas. You know Kill the Wabbit? That's Flight of the Valkyries. That comes from this. You ever wonder why Vikings have horned helmets? That actually comes from the Ring Cycle. You know that story that the dentist tells Django about Brunhilde and the mountain? That's Brunhilde from this story. You know how people say it ain't over till the fat lady sings? That's Brunhilde during her immolation scene at the end of Götterdämmerung. At least I think it is. But musically, this is kind of the ultimate soundtrack for me, at least as far as I've been able to find. See, everything gets a leitmotif. Everything has some kind of representative music. I'd like to read you a passage from Robert Donington's Wagner's Ring and Its Symbols, which I use as kind of a Ring Cycle Bible to try and decode this massive work. There is no motive in the ring. Side note, I want to take this minute to mention, I've heard people complaining that I call it leitmotif and some other people spell it and pronounce it leitmotiv. It's all anglicized German, so it's kind of a potato-potato sort of thing. Don't worry about it. It's just something to keep in mind. Okay, back to the book. There is no motive in the ring which cannot be traced either directly or indirectly to the simple arpeggio figure with which Rheingold opens. What he's basically saying is that every single leitmotif, all 100-ish of them, can be traced back to this. Which is what this entire opera series opens with. And a lot of people say that this opening is related to nature. Sure, so when we meet up with Erda, goddess of earth, the connection is pretty clear. Or you can see how that nature opening becomes the leitmotif that represents the river Rhine, which then turns into the leitmotif that represents gold, which they find in the river Rhine and is of nature. Okay, but here's the thing. I'm not going to cover all 4 operas. We can talk about how the ending, Götterdämmerung, which is Twilight of the Gods, is actually the nature leitmotif upside down because all of Valhalla is on fire and crashing down to earth and everything is kind of resetting to the beginning of the story. We could talk about how the leitmotif for the actual ring becomes the leitmotif for Valhalla because Wotan uses the ring to pay for Valhalla. We could even talk about my favorite part of the opera where Wotan breaks his spear, but his spear motif actually breaks during the farewell scene at the end of the Valkyrie because the spear leitmotif literally breaks in the music as a result of him beginning to sacrifice his power because of his love for his children, sort of. The story's is really hard to explain, and that's kind of the problem. I would love to go into depth about the ring, but there's this huge issue with talking about the ring cycle. Most people don't know the story of the Ring of the Nibelung, so unlike Star Wars or Superman or some other easy pop film reference, I'd have to explain the story, and that in and of itself is an issue because the running time for the entire 4-part opera is about 15 hours long, 12 if you rush it, 18 if you take your time. And like I said, Donington has over 90 individual leitmotifs, and other sources that I've seen have more. Even finding the scenes and the individual clips of leitmotifs is a nightmare, which is why I'm taking all these leitmotif clips from a YouTube channel that's literally called Wagner Leitmotifs. So that's really why I don't talk about it, because it's almost impossible to convey exactly how much is in it. Not because it isn't popular anymore, but just because there's too much stuff to go through. Like, think about it. The ring cycle is 15 hours of opera. That's a lot, right? That's a lot to sit through. That's a lot of information to digest. But realize that there's about 40 hours of films to get through before you're current in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, right? So imagine if I wanted to explain something in Infinity War, but no one had ever seen a Marvel movie. That's kind of the situation I'm in right now. But then again, that's kind of the perfect comparison and a great example of why I keep complaining about soundtracks. The ring cycle is 15-ish hours and has 90-ish leitmotifs in it, right? The entire Marvel Cinematic Universe is easily double that in runtime, and Infinity War had, 2.5 leitmotifs? The main theme from the original Avengers, Wakanda, and they gave the Guardians a new disco tune. Got speed to move into that rubber band off the ground. Which is fine, and if you like it, great. And no shade to Silvestri. He did a great job with what he had. The Marvel Cinematic Universe has totally trashed its musical continuity. There's actually a great video on that very subject, links in the description below. And this is kind of why I rant and rave about leitmotifs, because in the 40 hours of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, there's just so little overlapping information to go over. Imagine if every single character had a theme, and all those characters that have shown up as a team all have thematic relationships in the music. Imagine if this franchise actually had a musical tapestry holding it together. It could have beat Star Wars and Lord of the Rings for the best film soundtrack ever. It just had so much potential, and it feels like they kind of just watched that opportunity sail by. Like, just think about it for a minute. Why is the music that plays right here when Iron Man is leaving Earth the exact same music that plays when Captain America sacrifices himself?
Tell me you're not on that ship.
Yeah.
God, no, please tell me you're not
Honey,
on that ship.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I don't know what to
Come
say.
back here, Tony. I swear to God,
Pep.
come back here right now.
He'll know what to do.
There's not enough time. This thing's moving too fast and it's heading for New York.
And the parallels between the scenes are pretty clear. Credit to Reddit for finding this one. But again, why would you have some crazy obscure reference when Iron Man himself doesn't even have a theme? Or technically he has 3, depending on how you look at it, which in my opinion is a huge slap in the face on Disney's part. You can't go a month without hearing about how much Disney has planned for the next phase of Marvel movies, and it's clear that they're planning on how these films are going to play out. Like, Red Skull vanishes in the first Captain America and then reappears basically a decade later. Chris Evans had to sign on to umpteen movies because of what Disney had planned? Think of this from a musical perspective. Imagine if every time you saw Iron Man, he was played by a different actor, or the actor just switched halfway through a film and no one had a problem with it. Why doesn't Cap have a theme that shows up here? Does Thanos have a theme? Do the Stones have themes? There's a half dozen, no pun intended, things you can do with just the Stones alone. Maybe there's a bunch of musical stuff they're doing and I just suck and I'm missing it. I don't know. But that's kind of the argument, right? There's a good chance that a lot of people won't care about being able to hear this stuff in their soundtrack, so it doesn't really matter if you have it in your soundtrack or not. It won't affect the sales, even though all the biggest film franchises in history have done this and had some sort of larger musical framework binding their series together. But that's kind of why I don't really gear these videos at composers. Every musician out there already knows about the ring cycle. I gear these videos toward people who maybe don't spend every waking hour looking at music, because it almost feels like we've ended up hitting a point where directors and producers are putting whatever they think sounds good in their films, which is fine. If that's what you want to go for, knock yourself out. It's your movie, you can do what you want with it, and if you like it, then that's great. But in the end of the day, you have to understand how music works and what that's going to accomplish. Thor Ragnarok used the Immigrant song to represent this new Thor. And that sort of became an indirect leitmotif for this new version of Thor, because as soon as Infinity War came out, I kept seeing fan edits of the Immigrant song over Thor's arrival in the world's most ambitious crossover. So even if you aren't consciously using music in a leitmotivic way, it's still going to become a leitmotif in the popular conscious whether you like it or not. And by turning a blind eye to that, you're sacrificing an immensely powerful storytelling device. And it's the utilization of music as that storytelling device that makes the Ring Cycle my favorite soundtrack. Assuming that I'm not wrong, and don't forget, I could always suck at this is the best example I've been able to find of music being used to tell a story. And I hope that by just knowing what music is capable of, more people can appreciate its storytelling potential. Thanks for watching. I'd like to thank my patrons for making these videos possible, with a very special thank you to Hayden Elza, Donovan Hodges, Andrew Luke, AFN Matt, Ethan Rooney, Karen Rosenau, and Clara Tan. If you like what you saw here, be sure to subscribe and check out my other videos. Follow me on Twitter and Twitch to have your musical questions answered live, and if you really like what I'm doing, consider supporting the channel on Patreon. That's all I got for now. Thanks for watching.